First, with much of southeastern Queensland and northern New South Wales on the coast inundated, with much more torrential rain tipped to move down east, as important as the issues in Ukraine are tonight, we've got tens of thousands of our own here in this country who face life and death situations stranded by floodwaters, and even when rescued, face days and weeks living in disaster accommodation as they try to rebuild their lives. Well, thank God for the SES, I say this all the time, and the Army and all those emergency workers, and the phenomenal skill of those helicopter pilots in scenes today that look straight out of a Hollywood movie rather than the reality across many communities as people were winched to safety. Invariably, when trouble comes, Australians pull together, and there are countless stories emerging of neighbours helping neighbours and strangers rescuing strangers as decent people do what's needed to make the best of a bad situation. Given that these parts of Australia are always flood prone, for instance, the 2011 floods were considerably worse than these, at least so far in Brisbane, I hope there won't be too much overexcitement and chatter about climate change. As Dorothea McKellar observed over a century ago, Australia has always been a land of drought and flooding rains. There are some lessons to be learned, though, especially about managing dams to minimise floods rather than to conform to ideology. One of Australia's best investigative reporters is the Australian newspaper's Hedley Thomas, and he's closely followed dam management in Queensland for the past decade. Today he warned that Brisbane has had a lucky escape, that the current floods would have been much worse had the rain not stopped when it did, because the operators of the Wyvern Hoe Dam upriver of Brisbane don't always make sufficient allowance for forecast rainfall. And Thomas is right. Back in 2011, it was a sudden release of water from the dam necessitated by the need to protect the dam's structural integrity that mightily worsened that flood. Operators hadn't released water earlier, it seems back then, because of scepticism about ultra-heavy rainfall forecasts in this era of climate change. A subsequent Royal Commission into the devastation caused found that dam operators had falsified their report to protect their professional reputations and to hide the fact that they hadn't followed the dam's operating manual and thereby triggered liability for massive damages. Wyvern Hoe Dam serves two purposes. Of course, it's a water storage, Brisbane's biggest, but it's also a flood mitigation dam. And with southeastern Queensland is hit with what the Premier has described as a rain bomb, it's flood mitigation that must come first. Regardless of what's happening with climate, whether overall rainfall is increasing or decreasing, or whether extreme weather events are getting more likely or less, we just have to accept that much of eastern Australia will always be prone to sustained heavy rain and make allowances for it. Indeed, in a country like ours, where there always seems to be too much water in some parts and never enough in others, the fact that we still haven't done the engineering work to capture it where there's the excess and get it to the more drought-prone areas is something that I regard as one of our greatest failures in government, local, state and federal, bar none. All levels of government share blame here, and both sides of politics too. We don't have a water scarcity problem in Australia. We have a water management problem. And surely, if we can put a man on the moon, we should be able to fix this. Given that a brilliant engineer devised a scheme, the Bradfield scheme, back in 1938, it stacks up even today. So let's have a political leader in this country brave enough to tackle the green lobby and make it happen. On the immediate issue of Brisbane's Wyvern Hoe Dam, as Hedley Thomas said today, and I quote, "It is reckless to have a dam operating manual which does not permit precautionary pre-flood releases of water when extreme rainfall is forecast." And he went on, "And when you see it falling in northern catchments near Noosa and Gympie," he says, "that should open up the floodgates." Good luck, not design, said Hedley Thomas, allowed Brisbane to avoid a substantially greater flood catastrophe. The freak weather system eased at a critical time when Wyvern Hoe was almost out of flood space. Will we be lucky next time? Over the past few years, our state and federal leaders have got used to telling us how they're always following so-called expert advice. But as we often find out, always subsequently later, The experts' value judgments are just as fallible as anyone else. That's why, in the end, experts can and should only advise. It's elected leaders who have to make the decisions and take responsibility for them. It's the Premier in Queensland who needs to assure herself that she's satisfied with the way dams in her state are managed. And it's all leaders, local, state and federal, have got to get serious about our water challenge. It should be an urgent priority at the coming national election rather than some of the rubbish that now passes as nation-building policy.